After making my video about cultural appropriation and the show Problematic, I was informed that the third episode of the show would be about Islam, and this time the questions were supposed to be from 4chan, which is not the best place for reasonable criticism, but at least they tried. I mean, they had to sort out the hateful questions, which there almost undoubtedly were, but that also leaves open the possibility that they left out legitimate criticisms because they either wanted to make the other side look like they didn't have any good arguments, or because they just didn't really understand the arguments to begin with, and so they automatically assumed they were hateful questions when really they were legitimate criticism. Keeping all this in mind, I set my expectations to the lowest they could possibly be, and I decided to watch another episode of Comedy Central's Problematic. And I have to say, it seems like they at least tried to get a fair and even discussion going. I mean, I still don't think it was funny at all, but that's just my opinion. But keep in mind, the show has to appeal to advertisers, so they can only do so much.
But why would you make fun of a sponsor? All sponsors are great. And speaking of which, here are some sponsors now.
The main issue this time around was that even though they at least acknowledged the other side of the argument, they didn't really address the problems. But that was to be expected since they chose to have this guy on. If you aren't familiar, this is Reza Aslan, and he's an Islamic apologist. He recently took some flack for eating human brains on TV, so when I heard he was going to be on the show, I knew I had to watch. The real question was, do I make zombie jokes or Narnia jokes? But anyways, getting back to the show, they did a better job of asking legitimate criticism, but they still fell short. The majority of what they said could be broken up into two categories. The first was false dichotomy, and the other were straw man arguments. Time and time again, they treat valid criticism as Islamophobia by creating a false dichotomy. You are either with us or against us. Just because I have an issue with the ideology doesn't mean I hate or am afraid of individual Muslims. I'm well aware that most Muslims I meet are not going to try and kill me, but I'm also aware that I could probably change that with a simple drawing. And that alone should give us reason to pause and think about what that means. I mean, is it reasonable to be afraid of those who wish to kill us? Probably. But again, it won't be all Muslims, which is the second reoccurring theme throughout the episode. Several times the panel of guests basically says, not all Muslims, as if it makes the criticism any less relevant. But despite the straw man, Moshe actually manages to ask a fairly reasonable question, which is that given all the violence and terrorism we see, aren't people somewhat justified in being afraid? Especially when you take into account Pew Research about the acceptance of Sharia law in Muslim countries. Aslan's answer to this question is that we have a law that prevents Sharia. It's called the Constitution. Well, that's all fine and dandy, Reza, but what about the rest of the Pew Research? What about the opinions on free speech and freedom of religion? What about the anti-apostasy laws that are punishable by death? Does it do any good to know that not all Muslims agree with those laws? Does it ease any pain and suffering of those who have lost loved ones to such state-mandated violence? No, it doesn't do any good. And it doesn't make sense to blame all Muslims either, but that's where the real problem is. That's the straw man that the show never addresses and seems to not understand. It's entirely possible to criticize an ideology, such as political Islam, and not hate or target the people who are part of that ideology. The same way I can blame Christianity for the Westboro Baptist Church without blaming any Christians except the members of the Westboro Baptist Church itself. I can also criticize an ideology that promotes killing apostates, honor killing, the oppression of women and homosexuals, without criticizing those who don't believe in such practices. So then, some may ask, why even blame Islam if it's not all Muslims? And the answer is simple. It's Islam's fault. It's the fault of the ideology. The reasoning comes from the Quran, and even though the same text can be used to justify the opposite, such beliefs are going to be widely shaped by the institutions that spread these beliefs. And if those institutions were like other religious institutions, then it may not be such a problem. I often hear, and they mention this in the show as well, that not all Muslims should have to come out again and again for every act of terrorism. And that's true. But when Christians kill someone, it's not expected that every Christian makes a statement, but rather that community and church leaders speak out. But we don't see that nearly as much with Islamic leaders. It's very rare that we see imams coming out against acts of terrorism. And those who do speak out, usually ex-Muslims, are often villainized as Islamophobes. Aslan also says more white people commit terrorism than Muslims, but white people are not an ideology, so people aren't killing because they are white. They might be killing non-white people because of racism, but then the ideology that caused them to kill is racism, not whiteness. Muslims don't think similarly because they're brown, they think similarly because they believe in the same ideology. That's what Muslim means, a follower of Islam. But skin color and race are not ideologies. So the beliefs that impact behavior must be something else, like religion or political ideology, or more likely some combination of those. They also say religion must constantly adapt and therefore doesn't really need active reform because it's ever-changing. But Reza Aslan constantly gives excuses for Islam that rationalize bad behavior and ultimately justify actions rather than calling for change. So maybe we wouldn't need a reformation of Islam if we didn't constantly have people making excuses for violent behavior. But I know it's not all Muslims. There was even a video submission for an audience question that asked how to support moderate Muslims, and the answer they give was pretty much just don't. They say that they're just trying to live their lives, which is fine, but that didn't answer the question. If you don't want to reform Islam, that doesn't mean other Muslims and ex-Muslims don't. And those who wish to bring about reform would probably be glad to have support. I don't really have an answer to this question either, but the best advice I can give is to provide monetary support to those who actively seek to bring change to political Islam. People that I've mentioned before, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Another piece of advice they give was to meet Muslims, talk to them, listen, and learn from what they have to say. They even say, don't go into a war zone, but maybe go to other Muslim countries. And well, I would, but you see, I'm a big scary atheist, and I have a bad habit of drawing cartoon prophets. And also, I'm very much attached to my head, and I don't want to lose it. So it's probably not a good idea. Probably. So let me know what you think by leaving a comment, and if you like my work, please subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on social media, the links are in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.